Good evening, British and American culture. Today is the second part of week 10. We have a lot to handle again today. I'll do my best to package it and deliver it to you and summarize the things I want to say. Uh, I am wearing my English rugby shirt today, um, just for the occasion. And I apologize to my Irish friends. Um, if you buy me an Irish rugby shirt, I will wear that instead. But this is the one that my father bought me. So this is the second part of what I call the 20th century boy. Like I said, there's actually going to be sort of three parts to the 20th century because this is the most significant era of the of America and the one that we focus on the most. We talked about, British culture going from the first millennium all the way up to, the 19th century so far. But America has become such a dominant culture. Has become so important to and so influential, so important to our life, and in ways that a lot of people don't realize that. This is the story that we need to focus on for the rest of the class. I am going to sort of insert a bit of Britishness into the last part, especially when it comes to World War One in part 3 of this. It's going to I am going to address how the British are involved in the whole conflict, the World War One, World War Two conflict. But for today, really, we're going to just kind of continue what we were talking about in terms of. I know this is very tight because I have a small board, but I call this the coming out party for America because it is America deciding that it's going to participate in the world stage. And I call it the coming out party for a good reason because coming out party basically means when a celebrity or a person becomes an adult or they become famous or something, and then there's this big event, there's this big moment where the person arrives and everybody notices who they are, whatever it is, bar mitzvah or your first movie if you're an actor, or perhaps if you're a country, your first intervention in Europe, which is what 1917 represents, where you sort of, your potential is already there, but this moment kind of makes everybody realize what kind of power or what kind of influence or what kind of status you have. So this is why it's not to say that it is a party. It's not a party. It's just an event where America takes its place, which, as I told you about, we've been talking about Manifest Destiny a lot, and you do have to do the assignment, remember, for next week. You need to choose one of those 5 categories, and Manifest Destiny here comes into play again. Although this is not necessarily a religious thing, it is America doing what it thinks it should do, which is participate in war, in politics, and take a hold to influence other countries on the global stage. So we've already set this up. So basically, we're going to talk about how isolationism just fades away and expansionism starts to come into play. Now, one of the personalities who's involved in this is the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. And I'm not going to ask you any questions about him, but he's really important because he's the whole concept of the United Nations was sort of his brainchild. And he believed that what he wanted really was to keep America out of the whole conflict. There's a lot of controversy about Woodrow Wilson because, one, he was fairly He was fairly, what do you think, Anglo-Saxon oriented. He was, if he was not racist, I mean, he was, a lot of his policies leaned towards favoring people of white races or Western races or Northern European races. So we'll leave that aside, though, just to for the sake of convenience in the moment. But I am going to mention that is one of the accusations against him. But essentially, he was a Princeton. He was a Princeton academic, and I believe he was the first academic president. Lots of presidents have different types of backgrounds, but he was the first one, of an academic background. And his attitude, his perspective on the war was to keep America out of it. And part of that neutrality was the fact that they could benefit, that they could sell, they could produce things that the European countries that were at war could use, and this would be of a huge economic benefit to America, and it was, and this is the reason why he was elected the first time, but he was elected the second time on the platform that he kept America out of the war, despite the fact that lots of people had feelings that they should be jumping in on one side or the other. There's lots of Germans in America. There's lots of Irish in America. There's lots of British people. There's people of different backgrounds who have strong feelings, but generally Americans would prefer not to sacrifice their money and their lives for a war that is not really affecting them directly. So he does that, and he gets reelected partially because of that, and because there's a huge economic benefit. And next week we'll talk about the whole 20th century and how America develops into this gigantic global presence. But for now, we'll just say, like I said, the vacuum cleaner is on London, and the back end of it is in New York. So it's just pumping money into the American economy, and everybody's pretty happy about that. But in 1917, the situation sort of changes, where America is sort of compelled to jump in. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a luxury liner called the Lusitania, which, it's sort of the same sort of Roman or Greek mythical sort of name as the Titanic. You all know the Titanic, probably, the famous movie and the actual ship that sank in the Atlantic. Well, there was this ship that was a luxury liner that was bringing passengers from the United States to the United Kingdom. It was just off the coast of Ireland, and a German submarine sank it. And there was 100 and something Americans on board, and they all died because the submarine surfaced and shot its torpedoes and took it out without really giving them a chance to surrender or disembark or anything, or abandon ship. So the Lusitania goes down, and this causes a lot of resentment, anger, protesting against the German behavior. But the Germans are essentially fighting for their lives. Whether you want to blame them for the First World War or not, it's not really the issue here. It's just the Lusitania was potentially carrying weapons, ammunition, guns, equipment, as well as the passengers, which the British government denied. But it turns out later that the Germans were actually right. And for propaganda purposes, the United Kingdom denied that there was anything that military related on it. But it turns out later that it was true. So, but it's not really about what actually happened. It's about what people thought was happening. And the main thing was that 100 or 120, 100 or so American citizens were killed by Germans without warning, suddenly, like a surprise attack. And they claimed neutrality. Now the Germans were saying, Well, you're selling military equipment, you're supplying the British, but you're not really selling to us because the British wouldn't allow American shipping to go to Germany. So the basically the Germans were saying, well, what are we supposed to do? You're providing all kinds of support to the French and the British, and you're not doing it for us. So we have to stop it, and this is the way to stop it. Anyway, this results basically in the Americans saying, okay, if you're going to start sinking all our ships and killing all our people that are traveling, and we're not going to be neutral anymore, we're going to help the British. It's more complicated than that, but basically this is what happens. So the Americans decide that they're going to help. And the Germans, because there's a revolution going on in Russia, which you're all familiar with because North Korea, and China were kind of offshoots of the Russian Revolution eventually, that there's a communist revolution going on in Russia, and the Tsar loses power, and the Russian government falls, and the Germans basically get a peace treaty because the Russians surrender, essentially. They don't really surrender, but they negotiate a really, really brutal treaty that's very unfavorable for the Russians. They give up a huge amount of their territory and their people and their industry in the East just to make them stop. So the Germans don't have to deal with the Russians anymore. So all of a sudden, all these German armies that were fighting the Russians are free, and they go to the Western Front. So this creates, you're going to have to look some of this stuff up, but I know the website isn't updated quite yet, but you'll see, I'm going to put some maps up there for you to see and just explain some of these main points to you. But I'm explaining everything in detail because there's a lot of this is not in the textbook. So it will be on the website. This is one of the rare cases where you need to refer to the website rather than a textbook. So I hope you're listening to this video lecture carefully, and you listen to me and you look at the website because it's not in the textbook, okay? Chapter 7 is really going to pick up next week. So you need to check out the website. Okay, so there's three main things here. I just mentioned that Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare. I said sub-warfare there, but submarine. So the Germans start attacking every ship in the Atlantic, no matter who it is. French, British, American, and they start sinking a lot of them. The Russian Revolution happens, which causes Russia to surrender, essentially. And then the Americans jump in. So everything becomes America, Canada, United Kingdom, British Empire, France, against Germany on the west. And that's how the war ends, is that basically the American intervention is too much. The Germans can't handle the influx of basically millions of Americans are arming and being transported over to Europe. And when the American forces arrive, the Germans smash into the French and the British and the Canadians as hard as they can before the bulk of the Americans arrive, but they're unable to break through. And when the Americans arrive, then it's a foregone conclusion. And basically the German country has spent all of its money and its effort, and they're running out of food. Basically, the German people are ready. They don't have a lot left to sacrifice. They've sacrificed almost everything they could. So they're unwilling to continue fighting, and they think that actually the American president, Woodrow Wilson, is going to give them a fair deal because he says, we're going to make a peace treaty based on these 14 points. And these 14 points, I'm not going to name them, but the 14 points are very important because the Germans think that that's what they're going to get, but that's not what they get. So the Treaty of Versailles basically turns out to be a much, much worse deal than the Germans expected. And this disappointment and disillusionment with the situation, and the fact that the Germans have a military presence of about 9 million soldiers still available to fight when they give up because they think that the deal is going to be fair, but after they surrender, the deal changes. They feel like they're betrayed by the French, by the British, and the Americans. This creates the really, really the deep resentment and bad feeling that sets up Hitler's rise to power. It changes the whole. This is what creates, like I said to you before, the turning point of our lives is the World War One. World War One, everything was a different. The entire culture of the world was different. World War One is the breaking of empires. It's the creation of the communist states. It's America becoming expansionist. It's just such a critical moment, and it's the creation. It's setting up Nazi Germany. It's all of those things, and we could have an entire course about World War One and World War Two, or just one of them. It's just such a big event. This is my hobby, by the way. You can probably tell that I'm kind of interested in this stuff. So, but anyway, this is 1917 is a critical year because all these things happen, and this is roughly about 100 years ago. Also, in 1918, as the war concludes, there is a worldwide pandemic, which is quite similar to what we're experiencing now. It's called the Spanish flu. And because of these huge amounts of soldiers and, gatherings and this destruction, the disease, a lot of water is contaminated, and there's damage to all kinds of structures. There's fire and death, and things are dirty and infected. For whatever reason, this virus starts being spread around, and its name is the Spanish flu. And I've read recently, and I can't confirm this, but I've read recently that it's actually the Spanish flu turns out to be the same, related to the H1N1 swine flu that we experienced about 10 years ago. But I'm not going to get into that because it's off our topic. But it's pretty. The signs that we were going to deal with the coronavirus sooner or later have been everywhere, and apparently we've been ignoring them. One of these things is the Spanish flu. So about 625,000 Americans were confirmed to be killed by the Spanish flu. And this is more Americans died from the Spanish flu than in World War One. So as bad as World War One was for every country, especially the European ones, but all countries involved, the amount of death afterwards doubled and tripled because of the Spanish flu. So, I mean, the low estimates, the confirmed sort of accepted numbers, 22 million, but the estimates of how many actually died, just like now, the testing, even with all of our technology and the internet and the medical technology we have, we don't really know how many people actually died in China, because China doesn't want to tell us, probably. No offense to the Chinese or anything, but it's not. Some of it's political, but some of it is just like how many people got infected before testing was circulated. And they're talking about numbers in New York City, for example. It doesn't mean the Americans are lying or the Chinese are lying, because they're not. It's just the disease is already spread ahead of the testing. So how many people in New York are actually have been exposed? They're talking about numbers like 2.7 million people potentially, which would be about 8 or 9 or 10 times more than who have actually been confirmed by testing. So how many people have died from it, and how many people died of complications or other pre-existing conditions? It's very complicated. So 22 million at the low end. It's better to say a range. 50 million people potentially died from the Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920. That's something that we might, I hope not, we could approach. Some of the scientists and researchers and officials in the United States have said that by the time the coronavirus runs its course, there'll be 1 or 2 million people dead in the United States, which is actually less than 1%. But it's still a gigantic number that's terrifying. So that happens in after the war. That's the moment, the event that I want to talk about. It's World War One. So let's move on. Let's just talk about some general concepts before next part 3 of the 20th Century Boy lecture is going to be how America dealt with World War II, and that's going to be, I guess, in a sense, a little bit more positive because in World War II, America turned out to be the hero, and they are the heroes here too, but not in the same way. Germany was not the same sort of evil regime. They weren't the same sort of. I mean, Hitler was just a. What can I say? He's a twisted maniac who was trying to exterminate certain types of people, and you can say that the Germans in World War One were bad, or they were aggressive, or they were barbarians, or something like that. But it's not the same. The Germans were disciplined, and they were aggressive, and they were militaristic. And the Kaiser wanted to win the war, and he was callous about death, and he disregarded the suffering of his own people and other people. But it's not the same as actively trying to commit genocide, which basically, if you're going to ask any American who the worst person who ever lived, they're probably going to say Hitler. Nobody's going to say Kaiser Wilhelm, because he was a lot more normal in many of the respects that he was a bad man who caused a lot of death. But so did Napoleon, and so did Julius Caesar and other people like that. But he wasn't actively trying to kill people, and he didn't have these twisted, habits and stuff, which Hitler did. So, back to the topic at hand. What are the things that you need to know when I'm going to ask you on the exam? The things that are on the board are the most important things. I always say that our board is really small. Normally I have an entire wall, so there's certain things, but anything that's on this board, you can be sure you should jot it down or refer to things that are related in the textbook and from the website, because this is what I'm focusing on. So, okay, America was isolationist, now they're expansionist, and they're interventionist, like I said. They're involved, not just expansionist, but interventionist, right? Overall, the entire Western world is going through this process that we call modernism, or modernizing. And there's art movements, and there's architecture, and there's philosophy. But let's just say there's some sort of universal principles that sort of underlie what modernism is. And we're not doing an art class. We're not doing philosophy class. We're not doing architecture or history. So this is what I want you to focus on. Modernism is related to the speed and power and progress that is represented by industrial power. Okay? So technology and science and industrial power all have these characteristics of making things faster, making things more powerful, and in the minds of the people that were building these things, improving humanity. That's what progress means. Getting better. We are getting stronger, we're getting faster, we're building bigger things, and this is good. But you're going to see next lecture that this sort of idea is not actually that accurate in many situations, because if you keep making things bigger and more powerful and stronger and more they become more dangerous. If you make things faster and stronger and bigger and more productive and powerful, at a certain point you get to something like the atomic bomb, where it's just like, okay, it's so powerful now it can just erase humans, it can erase human culture, it can erase human cities. And is that progress? There's a limit to the progress. But at this time, I mean, in the late 19th century and the earliest 20th century, before World War I, everybody, that's what modernism is this, we're going forward relentlessly, and science is driving humanity into this new era, and this is modern. And we use, I mean, one of the essential, I got a star beside it there, one of the essential principles of modernity is the newness. It's got to be new. It doesn't matter if you take something old and you repackage it or something, but like it can be a cannon. It can be a cannon, but it's not a cannon with wheels with a cannonball anymore. Now it's a gigantic metal artillery piece that shoots a shell the size of a car into outer space, and you have to move it by a train. Okay? It's not this thing on wheels that shoots a 2 kilogram steel ball or iron ball at somebody else like Napoleon has. Now the Germans have this monstrosity that takes 200 horses to pull, or you have to move it down a train track, and when you fire it into the air, it shoots a shell the size of a car into outer space, and it comes down in Paris and it kills 10 people each time. And you can't even see it. They don't even know where it's coming from because the shell is coming from outer space. I mean, that's modern. So the industrial power doesn't just create weapons, obviously. The thing that drives it forward until World War One, like this is the tragedy of World War One, is that the industrial power that's developing to provide all these things, like the assembly line getting going to make cars, it gets used to make weapons instead. And when you take industrial power that was supposed to provide airplanes, cars, appliances, luxuries, commodities, whatever people want, tools, things that people need, and then you harness that industrial power and you put it towards military purposes, you create something so destructive that people, I mean, that's what really destroyed modernism, was that World War One and World War Two broke that perception that progress and newness were always good, that human beings could take it too far, and if we took it far enough, we would become extinct. We would erase ourselves. That's ultimately where the atomic bomb takes us at the end, is that we have developed our science and technology. We've progressed so far that we have the potential to actually wipe ourselves off the planet completely. And what culture does that, creates that? The American culture does. They are the ones who perfect the technology and progress far enough that they could have destroyed us. They could have destroyed other countries, but in so doing, they could have destroyed the world itself. And at that point, modernity was broken. But in World War One, that hasn't been tested yet. It hasn't been pushed that far. So that will be part of the idea that runs through the main idea, part of the main idea that we're going to talk about in the second lecture, the third lecture. This is number 2. When we talk about the part 3 this week, we're going to take ourselves through World War II and into the Cold War, and just how this transforms American culture. And as it transforms American culture, it transforms global culture too. And as I said, don't look for stuff in the textbook this week, because you won't find it. This is something that needs to be added. So this is a new lecture, and a topic that I consider important that should be included in the 3rd edition. So you're going to have to refer to a write-up that's going to be included later this week on the website. And there you can find all the information you need to summarize what I'm talking about in this lecture and the 3rd one. And then for the remaining lectures of the class, we'll be back in the textbook. So I thank you again for listening, and I hope the information was useful and inspiring and sobering. And remember, coronavirus is not the first time human beings have dealt with this sort of thing. So if you care to investigate further, please go ahead and Google or Naver Spanish flu, and then you'll find probably some interesting similarities between that pandemic and the one that we're dealing with now. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again later this week.